Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Here on the Monday edition of Balance of Power, as we wait for not only this market to close, but potentially an announcement on a running mate later today into tomorrow. Kailey, of course, it comes after a weekend that we saw Donald Trump on the campaign trail in Atlanta, and he's blaming Kamala Harris for this stock drop today. You pointed this out to us when he put it on Truth Social. You can't play games with markets. Kamala crash, he's calling it.
Yeah, and I'm seeing a lot of Kamala crash circling in certain circles on
is that
X
trending now?
Today.
Not
at
surprised.
least trying to make it so. But there is the point of consideration here. I've seen it show up in a number of strategist notes as well that noted that there was a relationship between the way we saw the S&P 500 performing and the odds of a Trump victory. In November. And how much could we attribute what we're seeing today to the fact that there's at least been a recalibration in the race now that Kamala Harris is the Democratic nominee?
They were talking about a Harris trade last week with solar stocks and some other things moving. I don't know if that's real either, but Christopher Smart has thoughts on this. I'm glad to say he's back with us, the managing partner at Arbroath Group, former special assistant to the president for international economics during the Obama administration. Christopher, it's good to see you, and thanks for joining here. How do you see that idea, the unwind of the Trump trade, and maybe more broadly, as Barry Ritholtz was mentioning earlier, disappointment over the idea that corporate taxes may not be cut here in a Kamala Harris campaign turned presidency? Is that part of this picture on Wall Street?
I think if it's part of the picture, it's a very small part of this picture. If it would be the first time in a long time, maybe ever, that for all of my respect for the Vice President of the United States, that any Vice President of the United States has had any impact on the equity market. I think it's also the suddenness of this sell-off really tells you more, I think, about the market itself, the sentiment, the positioning, than any one piece of data. I mean, I think those of us who are trying to piece together what has happened over the last few days, you start adding up small things like the unemployment report, Warren Buffett selling down his equity stake, the yen trade, the carry trade out of Japan, unwinding, all of those things kind of add up to this, people looking at their portfolios and saying, gosh, I'm overweight these very risky stocks, the valuations aren't so great, and everybody starts to run for safety. So I think it's more a combination of equity market factors than anything even in the macro data, let alone the politics.
Well, if we zero in on the data, though, if you look at the weak data we got in terms of ISM manufacturing, then, of course, the softer jobs report we got Friday, does anything within that, Christopher, suggest to you that regardless of whether or not the Fed decides to move intermeeting, as some in the market are betting on today, or perhaps move in September in the expected 25 basis point amount, that the Fed already will have gone too late, that something will have already broken by the time we get to that meeting?
Well, you've seen it in all the commentary in the last 48 hours.
Certainly.
I think it's a lot of overreaction to a Fed that has been very methodical about its approach, has been fairly transparent about it. I think the calls for an inter-meeting cut right now would freak out the market even more than it is right now. And I think we'll probably see, maybe if the data continues to come in weak, particularly on the employment side, between now and the end of August, we might see 50 instead of 25 in September. But I'm not sure you're going to see the Fed reacting to this market dynamic right now. And as you were just saying a few minutes ago, we're more likely than not to see some people start coming in on the buy side now that, you can buy NVIDIA at a much at a welcome discount to what you were buying it for a few weeks ago.
Fair enough. Could get better, I guess, too, as we go. Christopher, I'm compelled by this whole narrative that Jay Powell has screwed up again. He was late to start, and he's going to be late to finish, when he might be sitting back smirking right now thinking that this was the point, that he wanted the market to capitulate, and he can now move forward with cutting.
It's the poor guy. He's either a dope or an evil mastermind, or a good mastermind.
Right.
More like, the truth of the matter is he's a really bright guy who's trying to make sense of some very complicated data at a very tricky time in our nation's history, right before a very polarized election. I think the one thing we do know about him and the rest of the members of the FOMC is they're not going to jump and react to a few days of trading in the equity market. I think they will pay extra attention to the labor data that's coming in because that's what the market is signaling. I mean, are we wrong about the soft landing? Is there more weakness there than we think? Is that unemployment uptick because more people are coming out looking for work, or is it because the hiring is cooling down? The data still seems to show that balance sheets are strong, consumer demand is still good, earnings are weaker, but they were supposed to be weaker. Remember, they were cooling down the economy. That's what he was trying to do. So I guess, Joe, to your point, it does feel to me like he's more likely sitting back and saying, this is what I was hoping would happen, rather than, panicking.
Well, as you allude to the question of whether or not the soft landing ultimately is going to be realized, we did see Goldman Sachs and Jan Hatzius over there raising their recession odds in the next year to a still, I guess you could say, relatively low 25%. So we're talking 1.25% chance here. That's up from 15%. Right. Where would you put the odds right now, Christopher?
I'm sorry. Stop the presses. We've gone from 15 to 25%. And Jan,
they're still higher.
Jan is an extraordinarily talented economist and market strategist, so I'm pulling his leg a little bit here. But yes, of course they're higher. They're supposed to be higher. The economy was supposed to be slowing down. The unemployment rate is supposed to be ticking up. The prices, as you recall, which is what we were all focused on over the last year, are coming down, and that's the good news. Again, I go back to the market reaction that is causing so much uncertainty right now. And I think we all have to come back and re-examine our fundamental approach and our assumptions here. What did we get wrong? What is it we're missing? But the market dynamic here, again, I think tells you much more about the way people are positioned, the way that risk on trade people have sort of gotten way out, if I can use an unseasonal metaphor, way out over their skis. And a few worrying data points have sort of triggered this rush to safety. So I think I would expect things not to bounce back suddenly from here. We might get a few more weeks, days of choppy markets, but I don't think it's my base case or many people's base case that we're now suddenly heading into a recession next year. But we'll be watching the data later this week. There's ISM data. There's another jobs. The weekly jobs report, and that'll have a lot to do with that'll say a lot about where this market is headed in the near term.
Really interesting. So you talk to Christopher Smart for 5 or 10 minutes. You start wondering if maybe it's time to start buying. Maybe this is irrational. Christopher, what would this market look like with a rate cut under its belt? Go ahead and correct me if you want.
Well, I don't want to say you should buy today. I'm just saying things are much more attractive, and you shouldn't be selling today. Probably is what I would say. I think, again, we're sort of looking at, maybe 3, maybe 4, 25 basis point cuts between September and January 1st. You start looking into next year, and, as long as the hiring data, the corporate balance sheets remain strong, credit markets still look relatively healthy, and you don't see any kind of, we're all sort of on the lookout still for those hidden accidents. Is it another regional bank? Is it an emerging market? Is it some part of the financial system that we can't see that is suddenly going to break under the stress of high interest rates? Those are all things everybody needs to keep an eye out for. But at least right now, I think it's hard to make the case that the data is saying we are headed for a recession. So I guess, my very tentative advice would be this is not a time to sell. And over the next few months, you'll be wanting to look to add.
Christopher, finally, we've spent a lot of time talking about the equity market today. It is worth noting in the bond market, however briefly, we did see a disinversion of the 2-10s curve. Is that a real signal to you?
It's a signal. It's worth looking at. I think it's got to be uninverted it's got to be steepening over a period of time to really pay more attention to it. But I think it's certainly something we need to watch. The dynamics of the 2s and the 10s are very different in terms of flows, different auctions. So I think it's something we need to watch over the longer term, but it's not something on any single day that's going to make a difference.
Fair enough. We're inverted by about 11 basis points as we speak. Christopher, great to have you on this Monday of Mondays. Christopher Smart, of course, formerly of the Obama administration, now at Arbroath Group.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Live coverage from Washington here, standing by for an announcement from the Kamala Harris campaign on a running mate. Reuters reporting earlier in the hour here that it's down to two. It's either Governors Walz or Shapiro. We'll find out as soon as tonight, or more likely, according to some, early tomorrow morning when a video announcement is made. That's exactly the way, Kailey Leinz, Joe Biden rolled out his selection of Kamala Harris, which looked a lot like the Obama endorsement. He was actually calling her on the phone. You couldn't see her. You just heard her voice saying she's ready to get to work. So we might get something like that.
Yeah, of course. That was in the 2020 cycle when we were in the middle of a pandemic, and it was a very different campaign. Meantime, here in 2024, after she makes this announcement, she's expected to appear alongside this person at a massive rally in Philadelphia. I've seen reports today, Joe, that they're expecting more than 10,000 people to be there tomorrow evening.
Yeah, they've got big travel plans. Going to be a different city over the course of the week. And J.D. Vance will be following, which is going to be fun to watch. He's got like the Oppo tour here.
Some counter-programming.
Counter-programming each of these events following Kamala Harris around the country. So it's on, as they say. Yeah,
still got to make the pick first, though. So to weigh in with their thoughts on this pick before it is finally made, our signature political panel, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, are with us, both Bloomberg Politics contributors, of course. So, Rick, assuming that Reuters is correct, and this really is between Governors Walz and Shapiro. Shapiro, on the one hand, may have a problem with some progressives when it comes to his stance on Israel and Gaza, his handling of campus protests, for example, while the governor of Minnesota may be too progressive for some. Who is least likely to alienate voters here, Rick?
Well, I think that you go to the biggest voter pool you've got, right? Everything is a percentage. Is it easier for Josh Shapiro to win Pennsylvania or Walz to win Wisconsin? And what is the relevant amount of electoral votes that go with each? And I think in both those cases, advantage Shapiro. Look, I mean, the reality is the most important meeting that took place on Sunday was with Eric Holder, who was carrying over the briefs to the vice president on the vetting. And what we don't know is what's in the vetted material. And any bad news in that vetting material could have much bigger impact on the candidacies of these men than anything they bring to the table politically.
Do you like this rollout idea, Jeanne? The video hits Tuesday morning, they hit the road, Philadelphia, carry on throughout the week. And if you do like that idea, wouldn't it seem weird to start this in Philadelphia with the governor of Wisconsin?
The weird label does not fit this team, Joe Mathieu. That's
okay. I used the wrong word.
I'm kidding. I do think it makes sense. We can't say it's an indication that Shapiro has the upper hand and will be the nominee, of course, because as Rick said, we don't know what is in those vetting materials. But I do think, regardless of who she chooses, whether it's Walz, whether it's Shapiro, both of those governors and then also everybody else who's been on this short list are going to come out strongly and continue to support Kamala Harris. They've all made that clear. So I think it is going to be a good rollout for them. It's designed to show the vigor, quite frankly, to show the differential in energy and age between a Kamala Harris and a Donald Trump. That had always been advantage Trump when Joe Biden was at the top of the ticket. It's now advantage Kamala Harris. She is going to be visiting all of these swing states in a very brief period of time, and that is a far cry from what Donald Trump has done. And I'm listening to Kailey talk about that crowd size they're expecting, and Donald Trump is not going to be happy to hear that, as we heard this weekend. He doesn't like those kinds of crowds. Kamala Harris. So he's going to be hoping that that's not the case in the tens of thousands.
Yeah, he'd probably like his crowd to be even bigger than that when we see him in Montana later this week. Jeanne, I also want to point out some of the polling that we've gotten over the weekend ahead of this VP pick, including the latest from CBS, which finds the vice president with a 1-point edge nationally, exactly tied with Donald Trump in the battleground states. But something else that caught my attention was that 74% of Black registered voters in this poll say they now will definitely vote. That is up 16 points from the last poll in July when Joe Biden was still in the race. Jeanne, how important is just that notion of higher turnout?
It's very important. It's an indication of enthusiasm. We saw that the increase in terms of people who said they're going to go out and vote amongst likely Black voters up tremendously from where it was under Joe Biden. In terms of support, she isn't quite where Joe Biden was in 2020, but she is definitely moving in the right direction. And I think unless she makes a big mistake with the VP choice, that those numbers will keep moving up as she goes into the Democratic convention and then beyond. So the momentum is certainly on her side. And I think it just underscores how important this choice of a VP is. If she was to make a misstep, something very shocking, somebody who, quite frankly, did what J.D. Vance is doing to a certain extent to Donald Trump, those numbers may stagnate. But provided she makes a strong choice between one of these two, she's going to be in a good position to carry this momentum forward. So she is feeling very good about where she is. She just can't make any mistakes now.
Rick, I want you to bring us inside a campaign that is trying to plan a surprise here, and they're planning it ahead of a 5-day, 7-city tour. So presumably, while reports suggest it's unclear if Kamala Harris has made up her mind, she probably has. And I'm guessing a phone call has been made. It's 1:30 p.m. on the East Coast right now. They would need to know, I'm guessing, 24 hours in advance of their first event together. But of course, you had to stage a super secret transfer of a certain running mate from Alaska to get to the Twin Cities at a convention. To what lengths are they going to right now to keep this quiet?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest problem they've got is leaking. Campaigns aren't known for their tight seals. And so that means, and the only way you can really avoid it is having fewer and fewer people around you who actually know what the answer to the question is, who's going to get the baton. And so that creates a lot of frustration. But there are two parallel tracks. There's one of the selection process, and we've talked a little bit about what's been happening there. But the campaign's ramping up. They're going to have an entire team assembled who will take that vice presidential nominee, whoever it is, and start running around the country with them, advanced people, schedulers, speech writers. There's a speech being written as we speak for the Democratic convention for a speaker who nobody knows who it's going to be yet. And so it's the most bizarre aspect of a presidential campaign, I think, which is this whole initiative around somebody who you don't know yet is being put together, and they just get dropped in at some point tomorrow.
Well, and of course, this doesn't happen in a vacuum either. Certainly, it's happening in the context of those watching and listening here on Bloomberg with the knowledge that there's a pretty brutal sell-off happening in financial markets. And that's something that isn't unique to today. You could look back to last week as well. The economic data, Jeanne, would suggest that things are softening in a more material way. How does this kind of split screen risk playing out for Kamala Harris if she wants this excitement around her VP pick, but on the other hand, sentiment around financial markets and the economy may be souring as we speak?
Absolutely. And you look at the YouGov CBS poll, that is her biggest weakness. People still feel that they would be much better off under Donald Trump in terms of their personal wealth and the economy. And he, of course, is playing off on that. I'm looking at Truth Social right now. He has repeatedly said Kamala crash versus, what is it, Trump cash, I guess it is in my notes. And he has said that over and over. I have to keep notes on these things. He has said that over and over and over again, which I think is an indication as to how strongly the campaign feels, his campaign, and knows that this is an enormous weakness for her. So, do I think it's had a huge impact on her at this moment? No. You just had a great interview with Christopher Smart where he said Vice presidents historically don't cause markets to go down. That's true. But if this remains an issue throughout the campaign, it's her big Achilles heel. They've got to get their head around this. And she's got to be able to respond to how she do things differently. Otherwise, this will continue to drag her poll numbers down, or at least keep her even with Donald Trump.
Of course, it's not just the stock market itself. It's what the stock market is reflecting here. And if that happens to be a recession, we're dealing with a much greater problem potentially for the incumbent party. Jeanne, Sheehan, Zaino, Rick Davis, great conversation, great panel as always. Bloomberg Politics contributors.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
It's another tough one here as Donald Trump blames the sell-off on politics, and specifically the idea of Kamala Harris winning the election. On Truth Social, of course there's a massive market downturn. Kamala is even worse than Crooked Joe, he writes. Markets will never accept the radical left lunatic that destroyed San Francisco and California as a whole. Next move. This is the former president of the United States. All caps. The Great Depression of 2024. Exclamation point. You can't play games with the markets, he says. Kamala crash. Of course, if you listen to and watch Bloomberg, if you have a terminal in front of you, you know there's a lot more going on here. And in times like these, we seek wisdom from voices of experience. Of course, no more helpful at this time than the great Barry Ritholtz. You know him as the host of Masters in Business here on Bloomberg, but he's also chairman and CEO of Ritholtz Wealth Management. And Barry, really glad that you could join today. Thank you for being with us here in the political morass. I don't mean to pull you into Trump versus Harris, but can you acknowledge that a change in the polls here is not causing a change in the markets?
So let me get to that. But before I zoom in on that, let's start at 30,000 feet. You know, we all tend to engage in this narrative fallacy that when there's a major dislocation in the market, we go running around looking for what caused this. And so far this morning, I've read, well, it was Buffett selling Apple. Wait, no, it was the craziness in Japan, the worst market sell-off since 87. Oh, wait, maybe it's not that. Maybe it's the unwind of the Trump trade. Oh, wait, maybe it's the Somme rule and we have a recession. And it's never just one thing. It's always a panoply of different factors that come together. Hey, I rarely am on the same side of the trade as Donald Trump, but you could make a feasible argument that part of the rally was an anticipation of, wait, we're going to get another $1 trillion tax cut. Wait, he's going to lower. We already took the corporate tax rate from 35 to 30 to 21. Is he really going to go to 15%? Arguably, when it was Trump versus Biden and it looked like a landslide, some of the rally you can certainly attribute to, hey, free money, 15%, you know, whether it's free money on the monetary side or free money on the fiscal side, and tax cuts are certainly fiscal stimulus. Sure, some of that could be that, but it's never just that. If I wanted to pick a single factor, and I hate picking a single factor, but to me, it's the fact that the Fed is a year behind the curve, and I've been jumping up and down and screaming this for 12 months. And, you know, the only thing worse than being wrong is being right. It of all the many things that are out there, and it's never just one, it looks like, oh, that long and variable lag that the Fed has been talking about, well, it wasn't quite as long, and it was a little less variable than I think we were expecting.
I was just struck by the speed with which this whole narrative has turned, Barry. Do you think we get an intermeeting cut, and would that turn the market around if investors got the sense that the Fed cared more than they do now?
Hemingway comes to mind, gradually, then suddenly. The narrative with the Fed went from, well, maybe we'll see something in September. All right, we're looking like a quarter point in September. Hey, wait, It's a half a point in September. No, it's Jackson Hole in August.
Right.
People, especially Fed chairmen, are loath to admit error. And what Jerome Powell would have to say is, hey, this economy is a little more difficult to read and a little more mysterious in our post-pandemic era. And maybe I should have been cutting in May or June or July, just as a little bit of, like all stock traders overstay their welcome in a bubble. I think the Fed believed their own press releases and their own PR and said, we got this. We got a soft landing, despite lots and lots of accumulated data that, hey, this is starting to build up. When it finally snaps, it's that gradually, then all at once, the pressures build, the tectonic plates move back and forth, and the friction holds it in place for as long as it can. And then, boom, you have an earthquake. And that's pretty much what's going on right here.
Or is Jay Powell sitting back right now, cracking that beer saying, you know what, I finally got them to capitulate. Sure, go start lining up the cuts, but this was the hard part.
There's something to be said for that. Although, generally speaking, Fed chair, generally, but Powell in particular, they don't like these sudden spikes. When the VIX goes from 17 to 33, when it doubles overnight, they're not happy about that. That's very disruptive. The whole concept of a soft landing is, hey, the engine's cut out, but we're going to bring the plane in without any injury and put it right down. When suddenly a wing falls off, hey, it gets everybody's attention. I think it would take a lot for them to do that August Jackson Hole cut. But a couple of more days like this, it reminds me of that week in October 08, when Congress refused to do anything about the financial crisis. On Monday, they were like, no, the markets will figure it out. And then 15% later, that Friday, they're like, here's $1 trillion. What else do you need? So if this stabilizes over here, we're probably looking at September. If this gets appreciably worse, then maybe, we're back on in August. You never can tell. It really depends on I love Soros's concept of reflexivity. How do each of these little waves, when you throw the pebble in the lake, how do each of these little ripples affect all the other? They kind of combine in unexpected ways, and that's how you end up with a day like today, where it wasn't any one thing, but just the confluence of all these things.
Mm-hmm. Spending time with Barry Ritholtz here in the teeth of the sell-off. I wonder your view on the markets, more specifically here, Barry, and the technical levels that you're watching when it's going to be irresistible, right? We're going to have people jumping back into this AI trade at some point, or trying to game the system, trying to figure out where copper bottoms, but we're also going into a seasonally difficult period. So what does the second half look like to you?
Anytime we have a plus 14%, which is a good year in the first two quarters, the temptation is to tap out and take the rest of the year off.
Sure.
And while the fascinating thing about this moment in time and where we are is, on the one hand, we can clearly see signs of stress building up. Bottom half of the consumer strata is, the lower 50% of spenders are certainly feeling stress from higher rates, from increased credit card debt. People who want to buy residential real estate is still dealing with the shortfall of inventory, and that's kept prices very high. We're watching the slow motion train wreck of commercial real estate, which is going to unfold over not days or months, but years and decades, because of those 10 and 20-year leases. And so that's the downside. And yet, up until this past month, hiring has been robust. There have been wage gains. There's been consumer spending. Like, generally speaking, the economy has been pretty robust, and kind of suggests that, hey, this could be a little bit of a headache, but this isn't what is going to send us into a recession. So really, where we are is, if nothing untoward happens, this economy can keep growing. What are we going to see? A plus 13% corporate profits over the next 4 quarters? That's really substantial, assuming things don't take a down leg. And I hate the on the one hand, on the other hand, but we're really in that middle zone where what the Fed does, how the psychology unwinds. Where I mentioned some of this could be the unwind of a Trump trade, could be an unwind of 15% corporate tax rate. On the other hand, when you want to have a forward-looking political economy, Torsten Slok of Apollo just put something out today about the U.S. industrial renaissance. We've seen a giant uptick in that. So I'm kind of on the fence. We're not in a recession yet, but the warning signs are there that if we don't do something smart, we could be in a recession in 3 to 9 months from now.
Just answered my last question for me, too. I'm really glad you could join us today, Barry. I know we're talking about pretty tough stuff here, but somehow I always feel better after I talk to Barry Ritholtz. Find his podcast, Masters in Business, which you can hear on Bloomberg Radio on the weekends, too. It's one of my favorites. Chairman CIO Ritholtz Wealth Management. Barry, thank you so much for keeping a level head, or at least helping us do that.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
There's going to be some important developments in that arena in the next 24 hours, too, as we await, expected by tomorrow, the vice presidential selection of Vice President Kamala Harris, who will be her running mate. According to Reuters, it has narrowed down to 2, the governor of Minnesota in Tim Walz, or the governor of Pennsylvania in Josh Shapiro. And that's where we begin now with Lara Brown. She is a political scientist and also author of Amateur Hour, Presidential Character, and the Question of Leadership. Welcome back to Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Lara, as we consider that it may be down to just 2 choices, which one makes the most political sense to you?
Well, I would think that Governor Josh Shapiro does, if you're just looking at those 2 choices, largely because what is important for the vice president to shore up are essentially Republicans who don't feel they have a home within the Republican Party. There are right-leaning independents, and there are Republicans who have decided that they are uncomfortable voting for Trump and supporting a Trump-Vance ticket. And so that is really the play in terms of the voters that Vice President Harris should want to attract, because that will help her the most in the battleground states.
Well, you consider the importance, Lara, of Pennsylvania, and you do wonder why we're spending so much time talking about this. Isn't Josh Shapiro as well, considering the deep relationship that he has with Barack Obama, as outlined in the New York Times earlier today? Isn't this the slam dunk that the campaign's looking for?
Sure. I mean, I think most people have always seen him as a strong favorite. There are other options. Obviously, Governor Andy Beshear in Kentucky would not be a bad choice, because he fulfills some of the union's desires, but at the same time has been governing in a very conservative state for years. So I do think there are other options for her, but at the end of the day, it's going to come down to who she is most comfortable with and who she feels can be the most helpful. And that doesn't necessarily mean taking Governor Shapiro out of his state and taking him to other places. It may mean leaving him in his state to help build that coalition there.
Well, certainly on the other side, the vice presidential nominee is not being left in his state of Ohio. J.D. Vance is going to be on the trail, essentially following this swing state swing that the Democratic ticket will be on. I guess we'll wait and see whether or not we're going to get a debate between J.D. Vance and Shapiro or Walz or whoever it may be. We also don't know, Lara, if we're going to get a debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Of course, Donald Trump over the weekend said that he's agreed to one, just a different one than Harris agreed to. He wants to debate on Fox on September 4th. She wants to debate on ABC on September 10th. How do you ultimately think this gets resolved? Is there just not going to be one?
Well, let's not forget that former President Trump did back out of the ABC debate. That was set. It was scheduled. His team agreed to it. And really, at the end of the day, he doesn't like the idea of now having to debate Harris instead of Biden. And so he has decided to put forth his own proposal, which is a more favorable proposal because it's not only on Fox News, but it would be with a live audience, which are purportedly mostly Fox viewers, therefore people who would be cheering him on. It is a different proposal. And if he doesn't show up on September 10th at the ABC debate, then ABC has said they will make that airtime available to Harris anyway. So I think, we don't know how this is going to play out. But if he doesn't show up for September 10th, I think that is much more damaging to his campaign than if she refuses his latest proposal to go on Fox.
Well, I have to ask you about the messaging from the Trump campaign over the weekend. Donald Trump made his way to Atlanta, in fact, spoke in the very same room where Kamala Harris had a very large rally last week, got a lot of attention for it. And he used his time, it was a lot of time, it was another stem winder from Donald Trump, but he used a lot of that time to bash the Republican leader, the Republican governor of the state of Georgia, which many would argue he needs to win to be the president again. Here's what he said.
Your governor, Kemp, and Raffensperger are doing everything possible to make 2024 difficult for Republicans to win. What are they doing? I don't know. They got something in mind, they got a little something in mind. Kemp is very bad for the Republican Party. He wouldn't do anything.
Lara, what do you make of this kind of talk, knowing how popular Governor Kemp is in Georgia? And what is Donald Trump suggesting that they have going on?
I don't know what he's suggesting, and it's mystifying as to why he would take apart one of his own allies that he needs, who has also said that he would vote for the ticket. So Kemp has not backed away from Trump, and former President Trump should have embraced him in his state and really elevated the Republican unity, but instead he chose to create more divisiveness. And I think it's going to really sort of play poorly for him in that state because Kemp is popular. And certainly there is nothing untoward going on with respect to the election there.
Well, of course, we did get a response from Governor Kemp on social media. He posted on X saying that his focus is on winning this November, saving our country from Kamala Harris and the Democrats, went on to say, not engaging in petty personal insults, attacking fellow Republicans, or dwelling on the past. On the petty personal insult point that is coming from a Republican governor, mind you, Lara, we've talked a lot in the last week about personally insulting Kamala Harris on the part of Donald Trump, questioning her racial identity. For example, how quickly does the Trump campaign need to get that discipline message on the issues out there or risk alienating significant chunks of voters that they thought they may be able to bring alongside this cycle?
Well, the problem is that you can't really control former President Trump. I think Republicans have known this for a long time. His message is what he wants to say, and it is very difficult to corral him toward any sort of policy conversation and the like. And when they did, the Project 2025 has been nothing but sort of a disaster for Republicans. And yet that was supposed to be their grand conservative, proposals that they were going to put forward as being part of Trump's new presidency. And Trump himself backed away from it when he realized sort of how conservative and how extreme some of them were. So, really at the end of the day, former President Trump is running a personal campaign. He is a candidate who believes in celebrity, and he is somebody who believes in kind of his own ability to deliver a state to his presidency. But that has not been the case in the past, and we'll have to see how it plays going forward.
Political scientist Lara Brown, the author of Amateur Hour, Presidential Character and the Question of Leadership. Lara, it's great to see you, and we thank you for the insights today.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
With our eyes on the campaign trail and an announcement that could come at any time between today and, say, this time tomorrow from the Kamala Harris campaign. The reason why we say that is because her first event with her new running mate is set for tomorrow afternoon. So here we are, knowing that she met over the weekend with the 3 finalists at the Naval Observatory, that is where the vice president lives. And all the while, Donald Trump was in Atlanta, spoke to the same room, as a matter of fact, different people. But in the same room that Kamala Harris held that big rally last week that everybody made a big deal about, it was another stem winder by the former president. Here's Donald Trump in Atlanta.
Your governor, Kemp, and Raffensperger are doing everything possible to make 2024 difficult for Republicans to win. What are they doing? I don't know. They got something in mind, you know. They got a little something in mind. Kemp is very bad for the Republican Party. He wouldn't do anything.
What do they have in mind? This attack on Governor Kemp, of course, very popular in Georgia, was resonating on the Sunday morning shows. And a lot of folks are wondering if this is, in fact, the same old Trump, maybe not entirely reformed following an attempted assassination attempt. Mick Mulvaney knows all about it, the former acting White House chief of staff, former director of OMB, former member of Congress. In fact, he co-founded the House Freedom Caucus and a regular voice on this program. Mick, what does Governor Kemp have cooking? What was Donald Trump suggesting?
I think you hit the nail on the head, Joe. By the way, it's good to see you. I think he's referring to form. I think his conversion may have been short-lived. And in seriousness, what I think is happening is that the campaign, which has been very disciplined in the way they've run for the last 6 months, really has been whipsawed by the events of the last couple of weeks. You know, you're in a tight race. You have this big debate with Biden. You go up and you become a huge favorite to win. Biden drops out. You're expecting the Democrats to at least have some infighting before going into the convention on replacing Biden. They don't do that. And all of a sudden, Kamala Harris gets this huge bump and has this honeymoon that nobody really expected to have happen. And I think against that backdrop, Trump just went back to being Trump, which is just beating up on anybody he doesn't care to like, including Republicans. I don't think it's a very smart move. Again, he stopped taking my advice a long time ago. I just don't know who beating up on Brian Kemp adds to the equation. Real quickly, we had this exact same conversation he and I did in the Oval Office about beating up on John McCain after he had died. I'm like, Mr. President, There is nobody out there who wasn't voting for you, but is now going to vote for you because you beat up on a dead guy they voted for 30 years. That voter doesn't exist. Yeah. And I don't know who the voter exists in Georgia that was against Donald Trump yesterday, but for him today.
Well, look, that's just the name of the game here, I guess, following what we saw before the NABJ last week. Mick, I know you're supporting Donald Trump in this campaign. Are you nervous that he's eliminating chances to add new voters? He's, I guess, speaking to the base, but when you saw him up there with Rachel Scott last week, what went through your head?
No, actually, I put that in an entirely different category. I know maybe I'm contrarian on this one. I was fine with that from a campaign perspective. They were late. The tech didn't work. You know Donald Trump, as far as his television acumen, he wants lighting to be right. He wants the lights to be right. He wants to be on time. They told him that he had to be in person and he couldn't do it Zoom, and then let Kamala do it Zoom, and he found that out that day. And then the first question was essentially, when did you stop being a racist? You know, I mean, you can't. It was a horrible question from a really in a bad environment, and I think he pushed back, and I don't think it cost him any votes. Did it pick up any votes? I don't think so, but I think the simple fact that he showed up is probably a powerful message to the African-American community, especially when Kamala didn't. So, look, I put him in different categories, but I worry a lot more about Georgia than I do about the NABJ thing in Chicago.
Interesting. Questioning someone's racial identity in 2024 seems to have been a very coarse perspective for a lot of Americans. You don't see that?
That was those are two different things from the conference, right? There was the pushback against the ABC report, and then the comments about Kamala Harris. Right. All I can tell you about is she black or is she Indian or Southeast Asian, however you want to describe it. My guess is, Joe, and this is a guess, is that Trump didn't make that up out of whole cloth. He heard somebody else, likely in the African American community, raised those issues, and he was passing that on. So does it help? No, but again, I don't think it hurts that much given the few number of undecideds left in this race.
Kamala Harris has to pick a running mate today. Mick, a big moment for the campaign. Does the Trump camp care? Does it change the dynamic for strategy?
I think they care about the attention that it's going to get. Keep in mind, Kamala may be realizing that you can't always wait to the very last moment, because with the stock market doing what it's doing, with the Middle East perhaps doing something, she may end up being outshone in the news if she doesn't time it really right. I do think the Trump campaign will be worried mostly about Shapiro, because Pennsylvania is such a prize. I got to tell you, Mark Kelly, I like Mark Kelly. How do you not like him? He's a great American. But Arizona is not as big a prize as Pennsylvania, and it would create a Senate race in 2 years with a possibly weak incumbent in a tight Senate race there in Arizona. So I still come back. My long shot candidate is still Tim Walz. Tim, I happen to know Tim extraordinarily well. I consider him a good friend. He's just a really nice guy. And that might sell in more than just Minnesota. So while Minnesota's a small state, I ran Catholics for Trump in 2020. And the biggest difficulty I had selling Donald Trump was his personality. And if you send Tim Walz into some of these heavily Catholic areas in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, he might actually help move the needle a little bit. So that's sort of my long shot bet for the vice president for the Democrats.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting. There's the question of whether geography works the same way with a running mate in this cycle, in this media landscape. And maybe somebody like Tim Walz, who, by the way, I think served 6 terms as a member of Congress, has quite a bit of experience, could help on a sort of managerial level as well as help in the debate here. I guess we'll find out a bit later on today or tomorrow morning. It's a video, Mick. You do it all by video now, huh?
Come on, what happened to live television, Joe? What happened to live radio? Let's do it the real way.
Exactly. Or God forbid the two walk out on stage together. We do everything by video now. It's a social media world we're in.
It is. Look, I'm more interested in when she starts answering questions. Look, that's going to be a story until it's not, but it's a story right now. She's only, I think, taken one question, and the question was, have you made up your mind on vice president? Her answer was not yet. That's been the extent of our interaction with the press. So once she announces the VP, my guess is she has to start being a real candidate and going out and talking to people, as opposed to what you just described, doing videos and social media. But we'll see.
So that's the next big thing, right? The sit down interview, same thing that Joe Biden was doing before he dropped out. You have to prove that you can do that dance. Sit down, do a 45-minute interview with the reporter of your choice.
You do, and it would probably be ABC. My guess is for the Democrats. They'd love to go to MSNBC, but that's cable news, not the real thing. So they'll go to ABC, just as Joe Biden went straight to George Stephanopoulos right after the debate. That's home. That's safety for them, just like Fox is safety for Republicans. So my guess is she starts there. But we'll have to do all the networks, and maybe even we'll get her on Bloomberg.
Well, we'll be asking, of course. Mick, it's Kamala, right? I have to ask you that because people are suggesting that Donald Trump's mispronouncing her name on purpose. Is that a thing?
I'm not. I'm just not that smart, and I'm married to a Pamela, so I'm just. I mean, no disrespect if I'm pronouncing her name improperly. I apologize for that.
I didn't think you did. That's why I brought it up. Mick, it's good to see you. Thank you for coming back to talk to us, and I'll be curious your thoughts on this pick. This is going to be an interesting moment here. Of course, the former acting White House Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney. I can only imagine Mick's thoughts on what's happening to the Freedom Caucus right now following Bob Good. That'll be a conversation for another day. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.